Hello and welcome to Cluster 4 Safety and Risk. This is an updated video that would cover all the topics under Cluster 4. I would go through the learner guide and have prepared a presentation that would allow us to go into the topics that are covered under this cluster. Now, safety and risk, people normally ask, what's the difference? There are some differences. Obviously, when you talk about safety at the workplace, or work health and safety, or occupational health and safety, we're talking about, and we're focusing on the physical and physiological, psychological state of workers and everyone else involved in at the workplace. So it's more, injuries and environment. So those are the things that that is covered under safety. When we talk about risk is more wide. It talks about what's going to happen if you are exposed to something. Okay, so an example of risk, of course, there's a risk for an injury, obviously, so that's where safety and risk would cross over. But you can also say safety in money. There's nothing, there's not such a term as that. But you can say the risk of losing money, that's more appropriate, or the risk of reputational damage. So risk really talks about more of the consequences of what will happen if there's danger, if something bad happens. And that's the simplest way of being able to explain how those two could relate and how those two could be different, okay? But at the end of the day, when we talk about safety and risk, if you don't feel safe and you are at risk, you actually don't feel secure. It's all about feeling secure about something, where you work, as well as the business itself. When we talk about the business, our employers and the people who operate the business, they are more focused on the risk because that's what really affects them. So there's so many different types of risk that businesses face when safety and risk is not managed at the workplace. So that's the relationship. Once again, if safety goes up, risk goes down. It means that, risk is a consequence of not all, but some safety measures and topics on safety when it comes to work health and safety or occupational health and safety at the workplace. It's important that we always know why we're doing this. First answer to that, because you are legally obligated by the state. Okay, so each state would have the act that they would need to follow. So their legislative obligations, it isn't just about the business owners or the business operators, senior executives. When you read the act, which is what you should be doing first as a manager, is to recognize and be aware and really be knowledgeable about what our legislative obligations are. You would see that every single person has some degree of accountability towards meeting legal obligations. So not only are the business owners at risk for fines and penalties, but also us, the workers, even a visitor, for example. So we all have different roles. Now, the state of South Australia, New South Wales, Queensland, Tasmania, and Northern Territory follow WHS Act 2011, WA just started separating itself from Victoria. They used to follow the same act, which is the Occupational Health and Safety Act 2004, but Western Australia, since March of this year, has started to adapt the Work Health and Safety Act 2020. So it's not adapt, but to follow, okay? And of course, Victoria has stuck into the OHS Act 2004. What I've learned is that they've also made some amendments on that in particular sections of this act. So there are some legal amendments that have just occurred recently. And this pyramid shows you the leveling of our legal obligations and the weight of what we are expected to do. The act is the top of everything. So everything that we do underneath here all supports the one on the top, which is the act. Okay. And then once you know about the act, you would find that some are very general and you would need more information on how you could apply the law or the act in your industry and in your state. So there is what you call a set of mandatory standards that have been created to support the act and some regulations that support the act. So they come after the act. Okay, so these two on the top are actually what you call legislative obligations. When we go down below, it now becomes even more specific. Codes of practice is what it is. Practice or task, specific tasks like manual handling, certain things that are done at work now have the code. It means that the codes of practice are actually specific guidelines on how tasks should be done and in what way, okay? If you go against the code of practice, it can be, the code of practice is actually used in court. So it does have a lot of bearing when it comes to, you know, litigations and being able to prove that you have been negligent or you're breaching the work health and safety legislation, okay? So codes of practice is there, and then you've got the guidance material that supports the codes of practice. The difference between the two is the code of practice is in terms of its strength and its credibility. The code of practice have gone through a lot of scrutiny, you know, so a lot of filters, a lot of people, experts have all agreed on the codes of practice from different industries. So it's been studied very carefully, where the guidance practice do not meet some of the criteria, the strict criteria to be considered as a code of practice and may not be admissible in court as well. More explanation on the different types of legislative terms and what you should know about. So if you do have the time, read a lot about the act under your state, the regulations that your industry would have to know about, okay? The codes of practice that would apply to your workplace, and who is your regulating agency. So you've got WorkSafe or Safe Work, okay? So there are certain government agencies that are tasked to make sure that we can approach them to get advice on work health and safety. They also implement penalties. They watch and they govern how everyone will follow the regulation, the mandatory standards, and the act. Now, we talked about safety, let's talk about risk, okay? So, you know, I know you've heard of ISO because you've had your quality audits. But risk management is from, follows a particular framework or structure. And the most reliable of all structures is going to come from ISO, because ISO stands for the International Standards Operations, right? So ISO is a group of industry experts, professionals that have created Just had a conversion that stopped me right there. Okay, sorry about that pause. That have created rigorously analyzed standards that could apply to different industries. The risk management framework tells you about how you manage risk. What is the best practice to be able to manage different types of risks for different industries? Okay, so it allows you to have that skeleton, that map, and it's a very good skeleton, I should say, and a lot of companies have adapted to it. Not all have ISO certification. It takes a huge process to be ISO certified. In fact, you get audited, and you get some advice, some professional advice to get to that accreditation. You need to renew that as well every several years. So ISO accreditation is very important. It speaks about the quality of your management in terms of risk. There are so many examples of codes of practice here, so take time to get into the link and have a look at what actually applies in your workplace. Codes of practice is very easy to identify because you would know, like, manual handling applies to almost all industries, or all industries really, but there are certain codes of practice that do not apply to your workplace. So it's good to be familiar. And of course, any guidance material, okay, can also be accessed. And they're written in a more simpler form than the Act, most definitely. People who have a hard time interpreting the Act, the regulation, the code of practice, go to this guidance material because it gives you more information and in a more reader-friendly manner. Okay? And this is an example, workplace violence and aggression advice for workers. We know that violence and aggression can cause psychological illness, or injuries even. And to include anything that has to do with, to include an act that's against violence and aggression is very important under the Work Health and Safety Act as well, because it supports it. Okay. Now, you've heard of work health and safety a lot, but there are different words that are attached to it. One of the things that we should remember in management is called the Work Health and Safety Management System. What is it? Now, if you go to the Sonic Health Plus intranet, you're going to see what you call Sonic Safe. Sonic Safe is the term that is used by SHP to describe its system. Okay, so when you click on Sonic Safe, you will see so many things under that. Okay, it is a way of being able to communicate. What is the system on work health and safety for Sonic Health Plus? What's important to us? What sort of regulations apply to us? How are we going to follow them? So you need to have a system that can be used by the entire business as a framework, as a guide to be able to meet our obligations in work health and safety. Now, you may not be aware that you're actually part of building and improving that system. How it is when you give information about work health and safety in your clinic, you're already part of the evaluation process, which is one section or one part of the framework under the work health and safety management system. Who actually created this would be, of course, your OHS officer and your work health and safety committee, who make the decisions on what should be in that system. That needs to be improved, evaluated, and monitored very carefully, because work health and safety policies, procedures, and practices must reflect the current environment, the current structure, and the current need, okay, of the business. And without it, you're going to put the business at risk. Most likely, will you have higher insurance premiums because you don't have a standard and a way to meet that standard, which is the system, for you to say we are compliant and we're doing everything that we are expected to do legally under the Work Health and Safety Act. So these are all the benefits. The structure of a work health WHS or safety management system, there are certain sources that you can have a look at because the Australian, New Zealand ISO, and the ISO codes that you see there on the slide have had sections of it that's been adapted into several of our work health and safety management systems in different industries because it just makes absolute sense. In safety management, you have the risk management process. And to be able to deal with the risk management process, we need to have an internationally credible type of method or approach in managing risks, which I would then tell you it's under ISO. You can see that there, and people have adapted that. All right, so we have the different elements. What's in the system? So we talk about safety plans, training, monitoring, supervision, reporting, policies and procedures. It must be in that. Those are the components. What is the plan? The difference of the system and the plan, the system talks about standards. The plan is where we are, what we need to do to get there. Okay, so it should talk a lot about, the assessment of the hazards found in the workplace and how we could respond to that, what sort of control measures we are meant to do, and how are we going to reduce it, how are we going to improve our work health and safety practices. So the plan is there. And then you have what you call the duty holders, and it starts from the very top, going on to as far wide as even the community who may not actually work inside the workplace, but are affected by our operations. So, there are so many different people that are involved, and we all have our degree of accountability. Officers are the ones who are formally appointed to hold special roles in work health and safety, part of the committee or a representative. And there's a requirement for officers. They have to go on updated training, okay, because they do have a lot of influence in the direction of the practices of work health and safety in the business. And representatives are actually out there to speak and consult and participate with so many people. Their influence and their impact, their activity is actually more so than the other duty holders. So they need to have proper training. And the duty holders include contractors, suppliers, and visitors. Other stakeholders that also have their own duty and that can be impacted by the practices of the business. Our clients, we have government organizations like council, for example, insurance companies who provide us with the ability to transfer our risk to them, unions, and the community. Now, these are examples of penalties. So you can see that the company or the business operator or PCBU, okay, the owners or operator, are penalized with a huge amount of money, but they're not the only ones. Even the people, the officers who represent the business, and the individuals that are involved in the breach or neglect of our duties in WHS. Now, and one of the codes of practice that encompasses all industries would be this: consultation, cooperation, and coordination code. Employees are expected to be consulted to be asked about their ideas and contributions, and to meet and have as much of their say in the management of work health and safety and risk. So that is a code. Okay, that's why we have meetings, we have reporting structures, and we need to report everything that's happening there, and make sure that everyone is involved in it. Because, as I've mentioned before, in the law, no one is excused. Everyone's got their legal obligations. So we can't just say, oh, I didn't receive training for that, and blame that all entirely on the business owner. No, legally, you are obligated to make people safe, who work around you, and make yourself safe. So you can't just entirely put the blame on the business, because you've got your accountability as well. And managers, one of the managers' role is to gain commitment and to build a very strong work health and safety culture. And this slide here on a page in your learner guide tells you things about how you could gain the commitment of your team to understand and to be very to understand their contribution really matters, their obligation really well, and how they could demonstrate that, and what could affect them, and all that. So as a manager who takes work health and safety seriously, and you follow the policies, procedures, you involve people around you, it will encourage a very strong work health and safety culture. Okay. For recording and reporting, there is a tab or an icon or an option in the Sonic Safe intranet page. Okay, you can click on that, and it will tell you what the system says recording and reporting should look like in Sonic Health Plus. So have a read through that one. One of the reporting and recording under the work health and safety system is what you call the safety audit. Now, this is just an example. It's not the exact replica that's being used in Sonic Health Plus, but may I explain what these ones are, because a lot of us are actually expected to complete a safety audit, and most of us don't know what we're ticking or what are we checking. It's very important that you understand what controls mean, and this is part of risk control or risk management. When we say control, is about what do you see that is ensuring that that hazard listed will not cause an injury, an illness, or not put the business at risk. What are the controls? When I talk about controls, we're talking about the 5 or the hierarchy of controls, which I will explain later. But when you tick that box, if you only say yes and you tick it, but you haven't really looked into the controls, that is considered as not a very accurate assessment or audit. So you need to understand what you're looking for, and you also need to identify if those controls that are in place are sufficient, or you need to add to them, or those controls are sufficient but are not being carried or implemented. You need to be able to report that, because if a control is not implemented or used, that means you have opened the doors to injury, illness, and all these other different risks. When you have done a safety audit, right? So let's say you've identified the hazards that are needing to be worked on. So we need to put more control measures, or we need to do something like that. Before we decide on what particular control is appropriate for it, we need to assess, in this situation, what I see and what control is not being put in place, okay? And all the historical records that have occurred before on or before the day we recognize or identify the hazard, where are we at in terms of our level of risk? What's the likelihood for something bad to happen if we don't do anything about this missing control? Okay. And then what are the consequences? So if we don't do it, what's the likelihood, which is is it going to be almost certain, likely, possible, unlikely, or rare? And if it does happen, what's the impact? Is it going to be injuries, just first aid, or are we talking about a bit higher than that? So no injuries, but just near miss. And then we've got the first aid, and then we've got external medical, which means you have to go out and seek medical treatment from outside, not just first aid. And then we have extensive injuries, or you have to be off work for a long time. And we even have worse, which is death and major injuries, which is permanent damage. We need to be able to ascertain how likely is it going to happen, and then what's the impact to get to make a decision on what the level of risk is. So if it's high risk, there is going to be a guide on what the appropriate response is to high risk items. It could say it has to be done now. You got to put the following risks. There's timelines. There is an appropriate response when you have identified the level of risk. And there are so many different risks. We talk about political risk, and it has to do with taxes and anything to do with labor laws. And that would be part of work health and safety as well, is that when you're up against and you're being negligent and a breach of your work health and safety, how do you call this, obligations, then it is going to be a risk. Economic risk is about anything bad that could happen relating to employment, any inflation, supply issues. Social risk is about other people and how we affect other people, which is most likely almost in all cases. Legal risk, so any penalties or litigations. You've got technological risk, which we just recently experienced in Sonic Health, with cyber attacks or any malicious works in technology and damages. Also, policy risk is, what sort of things that could affect the accuracy and the appropriateness of our policies. Are we going to need to change them? Is it going to be challenged? Is it going to be ineffective? So on and so forth. So any change in our policy would mean putting our policy at risk, because if there's need for a change, it means that the current policy is not effective. Okay. I mentioned about the risk controls, and I said, depending on the risk level, there is going to be the appropriate controls that are expected to be applied. And these are the 6 controls. So elimination is absolutely the number one. We need to try to eliminate something, because that is the biggest way and the best way to manage risk. It's to eliminate the risk. Or can we substitute? So an example would be, there is faulty equipment. Can we substitute it with something else that is much more safer until that one has been fixed? Isolation is putting away and keeping people away from a place of risk, or an item of risk, an object of risk, or even a person of risk. Aggressive people. For example, personal experience is, if you have a robber there, how do you isolate other people who may not be in full view of that person? So keep away, or if you have an angry client, do you need to expose other people when they're angry and unpredictable? Of course, you need to isolate that particular hazard. So isolation is out of touch, out of view. Okay. Engineering controls is when you add things on an equipment or machine to be able to make it much safer to use. Administration controls are what we see all the time and what we experience all the time, including meetings, memos, reporting, training. That is all under administrative controls. And if you can see, it's on 5th. It's the 5th its effectivity is much, much lower than substitution isolation engineering, right? So it's not as effective as eliminating a risk. But in some cases, we don't have that option. We have to be exposed to risk, but we need to put controls in, right? And that includes PPE. So PPE is actually the last line of defense. And it's only for situation when there's nothing else that could, on the top right here, that could protect us, and there's still like residual risk that will stay behind. And you need PPE for that as well. So some people think if you PPE, you're safe. It's actually the last line of defense. Now, to know more about work health and safety, go through the external sources, because that's where you find the legislation, and a lot of these sources, like the safety data sheets from your suppliers and manufacturers, they tell you a lot about what you're dealing with. Manuals, for example, for the equipment and machines. Have a look at even, getting an expert to give you advice on how to improve your practices on work health and safety. For internal information, of course, you've got the internet, you've got Sonic Safe, and you've got your own committee, and your officer, Shaga, is just an email or a call away. So there you have it. I've gone through work health and safety and risk quite extensively for the last several minutes, and I think it must have cut in the middle, but I hope that has helped you know more about this cluster. When we go next, we're going to have a look at how you could complete the assessment workbook. I really strongly recommend have a good read of the act that applies to your state. That is the very good starting point. Understand what your obligations are. And then if you do understand what that means, and you have a very good understanding on why work health and safety is almost always top priority when in operations, you are able to explain that to your team. And it gives you very good ammunition to create strong culture of looking out for each other, kind of culture. So thank you. And till the next time.